Elena Martinez had always believed in the power of discipline and resilience. As a former military engineer, she had spent years defusing bombs in war zones, navigating life-or-death situations with calculated precision. Her life was built on control of her actions, her mind, and her surroundings. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment she returned to what was supposed to be her home, only to find that it no longer existed. The house she had worked so hard to buy, the one she had planned to return to after her deployment, was gone. Not burned down, not under construction, simply erased, as if it had never been there. In its place stood a pristine lawn, perfectly manicured, with a wrought iron fence enclosing the property. A sign on the gate read, "Private property. No trespassing." Elena's hands tightened on the wheels of her chair as she scanned the property, her pulse drumming in her ears. This wasn't just some mix-up. This was deliberate. She had spent the last 2 years recovering in a military hospital after an IED explosion left her unable to walk. The blast had shattered bones, severed nerves, and forced her to relearn how to exist in a world that suddenly viewed her as lesser. Every moment of that painful journey, she had held on to the thought of home, the space she had built for herself, the one place where she wouldn't have to fight, where she could be more than just a soldier or a patient. And now, standing in front of a property that someone had wiped from existence, she felt an anger she hadn't experienced since the war. She moved closer to the gate, scanning for any sign that this could be a mistake. Maybe the city had rezoned the area. Maybe a wealthy developer had bought up land in a major expansion project. But deep down, she knew this was personal. The street was the same. The neighboring houses still stood exactly where she remembered them. Even the large oak tree in the front yard remained untouched. The only thing missing was her home. A movement caught her attention. A man in a dark security uniform stepped out from the side of the house, walking toward her with calculated ease. He was tall, mid-40s, clean-shaven, and had the unmistakable confidence of someone who believed they had the authority to turn people away. "Ma'am, can I help you?" His tone was polite but firm, the kind that masked hostility behind professionalism. "This is my house," she said, her voice controlled, but each word felt like a grenade with the pin half pulled. The man didn't even blink. "I'm sorry, but this property belongs to the neighborhood board. It was acquired for redevelopment. You might have the wrong address." Elena let out a slow breath, forcing herself not to react. She had defused bombs under enemy fire. She wasn't about to lose control over a smug security guard. "This was my home. I have the deed. I have the records. I lived here before my deployment. You need to explain why the hell it's gone." The guard remained unfazed, but there was something in his stance, just a flicker of hesitation, that told her he knew exactly what had happened. "Ma'am, if you have any paperwork, I suggest you take it up with the neighborhood association. Their office is in the city center. But I can't let you onto private property." A sharp, bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "Private property. That's convenient. What happened to the house?" He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, a calculated move to signal that the conversation was over. She didn't push it, not yet. Instead, she wheeled backward, her eyes locking onto his like a sniper sighting a target. "Tell whoever put you here that I'm coming for them." She turned and rolled back toward her truck, her hands tightening on the wheels, her muscles burning from the tension. This wasn't just about a bureaucratic mix-up or a clerical error. Someone had stolen her house, erased her from her own land, and replaced her with legal barriers that would keep her out. She pulled herself into the driver's seat, her movements practiced but strained from exhaustion. She sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, her breath coming slow and measured. The street was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if the whole block knew what had happened but had collectively decided to pretend otherwise. She glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of a curtain shifting in one of the nearby houses. Someone was watching. They had been watching the whole time. She took out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she hadn't used in over a year. Karen Blake, attorney. Elena had never been the type to run to lawyers. She believed in handling things directly, in fixing problems with her own hands. But this wasn't a battlefield, and she wasn't fighting an enemy she could see. This was a war of paperwork, deception, and manipulation, An entirely different kind of combat, one she wasn't trained for. She hit dial. Karen, it's Elena. I need you to meet me in the city. Someone stole my house. There was a pause, then a sigh. Tell me everything. And she did. By the time she finished, Karen was already in motion. Meet me at my office in an hour. Bring whatever paperwork you have. If they took your house, they left a trail. We're going to find it. Elena ended the call, gripping the phone so tightly her fingers ached. She wasn't just going to find the people responsible. She was going to make them regret ever thinking they could erase her. Chapter 2. The Legal Battle. Elena arrived at Karen Blake's office exactly an hour later, her jaw clenched so tightly that her teeth ached. The drive had done little to ease the rage bubbling inside her, and the sterile, air-conditioned calm of the law office only made it worse. Karen was already waiting, standing beside her desk, dressed in a navy blazer and sharp-rimmed glasses that made her look as if she could dismantle a person with nothing more than a well-worded cross-examination. She gestured for Elena to roll inside, closing the door behind her before taking a seat. "All right," Karen said, her voice measured but edged with the no-nonsense tone that Elena had always liked about her. "Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." Elena placed the few documents she had managed to gather onto the desk, the weight of the situation pressing down on her as she forced herself to recount everything she knew. She detailed how she had left for deployment, how she had kept up with her mortgage payments through automated withdrawals, how she had never received any notices or warnings. She explained how she had arrived home to find nothing but an empty lot and a stranger telling her she had no claim to the property she had worked so hard to own. Karen listened without interruption, flipping through the documents with the precision of a surgeon. When Elena finished, Karen leaned back in her chair, tapping a manicured nail against the tabletop. "I've seen cases like this before," she said finally, pushing the papers into a neat stack. "They're banking on you not fighting back. They think because you're military, because you've been gone, because you're in a wheelchair, that you won't have the resources or the patience to push through the legal system. They're counting on you walking away." "Then they don't know me," Elena said, her voice hard. Karen allowed herself a small smirk. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. But here's the problem. Someone went through a lot of trouble to make this happen. You weren't just another foreclosure, Elena. Someone forged your signature. Someone erased your records. That kind of effort doesn't happen over $600 in neighborhood fees. That means this is bigger than just your house." Elena gripped the arms of her chair. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent another wave of cold fury through her. "So where do we start?" "First," Karen said, reaching for her phone, "I need to pull the property records. If your house was sold, it had to go through an auction or a direct sale. There's a trail, even if they tried to cover it up. The question is, who benefited?" Elena watched as Karen dialed a number, her eyes sharp with calculation. The conversation was short and professional, full of legal jargon that Elena only half followed. When Karen hung up, she sighed. "It was transferred 6 months ago. The new owner is listed as a corporate entity, some shell company registered out of state. That means someone is laundering property through legal loopholes, flipping houses they never had a right to in the first place." Elena's fingers dug into the fabric of her pants. "And my name?" Karen hesitated, and that brief pause was enough to confirm Elena's worst fear. "The records say you signed off on the sale," Karen admitted carefully, gauging Elena's reaction. "Your signature is on the agreement. According to the system, you voluntarily relinquished your rights to the property." Elena's pulse pounded in her ears. "That's impossible." "I know," Karen said calmly. "But proving it is another matter. Whoever did this covered their tracks well. They had access to your personal information. They had enough influence to move paperwork through official channels without raising red flags. And they had enough confidence to assume you wouldn't come back to challenge it. Then they underestimated me," Elena said, her voice like steel. Karen nodded. "Good. Because if you want your house back, we're going to have to hit them where they don't expect it. If they fabricated documents, there's a weak link somewhere. Maybe the notary who allegedly witnessed your signature. Maybe the person who filed the transfer. People get sloppy, no matter how careful they are. We just need to find that one mistake." Elena exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think, to plan, instead of just reacting. "So what's the next step?" Karen pulled a legal pad closer, scribbling notes as she spoke. We need to challenge the sale in court, but before we do that, I want to dig deeper into this company. There's a pattern here, and I'd bet money this isn't the only property they've stolen. If we can prove a history of fraud, the court will be much more likely to rule in your favor. But it's going to take time, and you need to be ready for a fight. These people aren't going to back down just because we call them out. Let them try, Elena said darkly. Karen gave her a long look, then nodded. All right, let's get to work. Chapter 3, The Investigation. The next few days were a whirlwind of research, legal filings, and strategic planning. Karen pulled records from past property disputes, and Elena spent hours tracing the ownership of the shell company, trying to find a real person behind the corporate smokescreen. What she found made her blood run cold. The company that had taken her house had been involved in over a dozen questionable sales, all targeting military personnel or elderly homeowners, people who were either absent or too vulnerable to fight back. And behind it all, linked through a tangled web of financial transactions, was the name Douglas Hale. Hale had once been the head of the neighborhood committee, the same organization that had supposedly placed the lien on her house. He had resigned 2 years ago under suspicion of financial mismanagement, but the case had gone nowhere. He had vanished from public life, only to resurface under this new scheme, operating through shadow companies and legal loopholes. Elena stared at the name on the screen, her gut twisting with fury. This bastard's been doing this for years. Karen set down the file she had been reading, her expression grim. And getting away with it. Until now. Elena clenched her fists. She had faced enemies in war, had fought against people who wanted to kill her, had survived explosions that should have ended her life. But there was something infuriatingly insidious about this kind of enemy. The kind who stole from people who couldn't fight back, who hid behind bureaucracy and technicalities, who destroyed lives with nothing more than a few well-placed documents. I want him to pay, she said, her voice low, controlled. Karen nodded. And he will. But first, we take back what's yours. Elena exhaled sharply, her focus narrowing. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. Chapter 4, The Counterattack. Elena didn't waste time. The moment she and Karen had a name, she knew sitting back and waiting for the legal system to work in her favor wasn't an option. Bureaucracy was slow, and the people who stole her home had counted on that. They had built an operation designed to bury victims in legal red tape, to exhaust them with delays, technicalities, and denials until they either gave up or ran out of money. Elena had no intention of playing by their rules. She wasn't going to let some paper-pushing cowards decide whether or not she deserved to get her home back. She spent the next 48 hours poring over every document Karen had pulled, every trace of Douglas Hale's activity in the past 5 years. It was a tangled mess of front companies, dubious property transfers, and forged documents, but the pattern was clear. Hale had spent years orchestrating real estate fraud, quietly acquiring homes that belonged to people who either weren't there to fight or didn't know they were supposed to. The stolen properties were quickly resold, sometimes within days, usually to companies that dissolved within months of the transaction. It was a perfect machine, designed to erase evidence the moment someone started asking questions. But Elena wasn't just asking questions. She was looking for weaknesses. Karen had filed an emergency petition to challenge the sale of her home, but that was just the beginning. It would take weeks, maybe months, for the court to process the case, and that was assuming the judge didn't dismiss it on some technicality. In the meantime, Elena needed leverage. If she wanted to win this war, she had to put pressure on the people who had made her a target in the first place. That started with a notary who had supposedly witnessed her forged signature. His name was Eric Calloway, a mid-level bureaucrat who had notarized dozens of real estate transactions tied to Hale's network. His name appeared on at least 5 other contested sales, most of them belonging to elderly homeowners who had mysteriously signed over their properties shortly before their deaths. That alone was suspicious, but what made it even worse was the fact that Calloway had gone completely off the grid in the past 6 months. His office was closed, his listed phone number disconnected. There was no online presence, no social media, no trace of him anywhere, except for the legal documents that bore his name. That was a red flag. Elena had Karen run a background check, and what they found only confirmed her suspicions. Calloway hadn't just disappeared, he had been forced out. His notary license had been revoked, quietly, without public notice, buried under procedural filings that no one had bothered to challenge. The reason? Falsifying signatures. He had been caught before, but instead of facing criminal charges, he had simply been pushed out of the system, allowed to vanish before anyone could dig deeper. That meant someone had protected him. Elena wasn't naive. She knew real corruption wasn't just about a few bad actors making easy money. It was about networks, about people covering for each other, scratching each other's backs while the rest of the world was too distracted to notice. Calloway was a cog in a much bigger machine. But even the smallest cog could jam the whole system if it stopped turning. She just needed to find him. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. It took another 3 days before Elena finally got a lead. A friend of Karen's who worked in real estate recognized Calloway's name and mentioned that he had been seen working as a consultant for a private real estate firm downtown, a firm that had ties to the very same shell companies involved in her case. That wasn't a coincidence. Elena didn't hesitate. She drove straight there, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The building was sleek and modern, glass and steel, the kind of place that screamed respectability while hiding right underneath. She rolled into the lobby, ignoring the way the receptionist gave her a quick once-over, eyes flicking to the wheels of her chair before pasting on a fake smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Eric Calloway," Elena said, her voice cold, controlled. The receptionist hesitated. "I don't believe Mr. Calloway is available for appointments." "That's fine," Elena said. "I'll wait." She didn't give the woman a chance to argue. She rolled past the desk, positioning herself near the elevator, making it clear that she wasn't leaving. The receptionist whispered something into a phone, her eyes darting toward Elena, as if expecting her to back down. She didn't. Minutes passed. People came and went. Businessmen in tailored suits, real estate agents carrying expensive leather portfolios. Elena didn't move. She was used to waiting. Patience was something she had learned in war, the ability to sit still while the enemy made their move. Finally, after nearly an hour, a man in his 50s emerged from the hallway. His face was pale and drawn. He was shorter than she had expected, stocky, with thinning hair and a nervous energy that immediately set her on edge. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her. "Miss Martinez," his voice wavered. "Let's talk," she said. Calloway swallowed hard. I don't know what this is about." "Liar," she said flatly. "Sit down." He hesitated for a second too long, glancing toward the receptionist, as if expecting backup. No one moved. Elena didn't take her eyes off him as he slowly lowered himself into a chair across from her, his hands twitching in his lap. "You notarized a fraudulent sale of my house," she said. "You put your name on a document that stole my property. You and I both know that signature wasn't mine. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me who gave you that paperwork, and you're going to tell me everything you know about Douglas Hale." Calloway's face turned even paler. I don't." Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I was a bomb technician. Do you know what that means?" He swallowed hard, shaking his head. "It means I can spot when someone's about to detonate under pressure. And you, Calloway, you're sweating. You know exactly what I'm talking about, and you're terrified because you know that if I push, you're going to break. So don't make this hard on yourself. Tell me what I want to know." He looked like he might pass out. His breath came fast and uneven, his hands clenching into fists before he finally exhaled, shoulders slumping. "It was Hale," he muttered. "But it wasn't just him. There are others, lawyers, brokers, city clerks. They move properties through the system before anyone can contest them. They pay off officials to look the other way. I didn't have a choice." "You always have a choice," Elena said. "But you made the wrong one. And now you're going to fix it." Calloway hesitated again, then gave a shaky nod. "I have documents," he whispered. "Proof of forged sales, bribery records, everything. But I can't just hand them over. If they find out I talked, you'll be dead," she finished for him. He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was enough. Elena stared at him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Then we do this my way. You get me those documents, and if you're smart, you make sure you're long gone before Hale realizes what you've done." Calloway swallowed again, but he nodded. She leaned back, her voice steady. "Tick-tock, Calloway. You're running out of time." Chapter 6. The Reckoning. Calloway delivered the documents 2 days later, dropping them off at Karen's office without a word before disappearing into whatever hole he had decided was safe enough to hide in. Elena hadn't expected him to stick around. Men like him, weak, easily manipulated, were only useful when fear outweighed their greed. But she didn't care about Calloway beyond what he could give her. And what he had given her was enough to light the entire corrupt system on fire. The folder was thick, filled with property records, fake signatures, internal memos, and financial statements that painted a damning picture. Douglas Hale wasn't just running a small-time scam. He had built an entire machine, one that had stolen millions in real estate from veterans, the elderly, and anyone else who couldn't fight back. His network extended deep into city offices, with officials willing to look the other way in exchange for a cut of the profits. There were names, signatures, bank transfers, everything they needed to prove that her home, and countless others, had been taken illegally. Karen sat across from her, flipping through the pages with the calm focus of a predator about to strike. She set the folder down and folded her hands. "This is big," she said. "Bigger than just you. We take this to court, and we're not just getting your house back. We're putting Hale and half the city's real estate board in a courtroom. They won't be able to buy their way out of this." Elena didn't smile. "Then let's do it." Karen exhaled slowly. "There's something you need to understand. This isn't just a lawsuit anymore. This is a war. People like Hale don't go down quietly. The moment we file this, they'll come after us. They'll try to bury it. They'll pressure judges. They'll intimidate witnesses. And if they can't win in court, they'll look for other ways to make this problem disappear." Elena's fingers drummed against the armrest of her chair. "You think I'm scared of them? I think you're smart enough to know this isn't just about you anymore," Karen said evenly. "You're not the only victim. We need to make sure we're prepared for every counterattack they throw at us. That means securing these documents in places they can't reach, getting multiple copies into the hands of people who can't be bought, and making sure that if anything happens, the case keeps moving forward without us." It was a sobering thought. Elena had spent her career dealing with tangible threats, bombs, gunfire, physical danger. But this was different. This wasn't an enemy she could fight head-on. This was a system, a deeply entrenched network of corruption that had thrived in the shadows for years. If they wanted to bring it down, they had to do it methodically. Karen wasted no time. Within hours, she had copies of the documents sent to trusted legal contacts, journalists, and advocacy groups that specialized in real estate fraud. She filed the first legal motions, ensuring that the case would be entered into the public record before anyone could try to stop it. And that was when the retaliation started. Chapter 7. The Fallout. It was subtle at first, a break-in at Karen's office. Nothing was taken, just drawers left open, papers rifled through. A warning. Then came the calls, anonymous, full of veiled threats and promises of consequences if she didn't drop the case. Karen met them with the same unshakable calm she met everything else, her only response being to tighten security and push forward even harder. Then they came for Elena. It started with her bank accounts, transactions flagged, funds frozen under fraud prevention measures that just so happened to make it impossible for her to access her own money. Then her truck, parked outside her temporary apartment, was found with slashed tires. No fingerprints, no witnesses, just a message. She wasn't surprised. She had spent too much time in combat zones not to recognize an intimidation tactic when she saw one. The people behind this weren't going to come at her openly. They wanted her scared, isolated, second-guessing herself. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning, she drove to the neighborhood she had once called home. She had no illusions about getting back onto her property. Hale's people had undoubtedly tightened security since her last visit, but she wasn't there for them. She was there for the people who still lived there, the ones who had watched this happen and stayed silent. She started with her old neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, a widow in her 70s who had lived on that street longer than anyone else. When Elena knocked, the door opened just a crack, held by a shaking, wrinkled hand. "You shouldn't be here, Mrs. Callahan whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching. Elena kept her voice steady. "I know what they did to me wasn't the first time, and I know it won't be the last, unless someone stops them." The old woman hesitated, then exhaled shakily. "They took Henry's house," she said finally, her voice thick with something between fear and guilt. He was a Marine, like you. When he got sick, they tricked him into signing something he didn't understand. He died thinking he still had a home. Then they came in and took everything. Elena felt her stomach turn. She had suspected this was bigger than her, but hearing it confirmed from someone who had witnessed it firsthand made her blood boil. Who else? She asked. Mrs. Callahan hesitated again, then opened the door a little wider. Come in, she whispered. Inside, she showed Elena documents, letters from the neighborhood board demanding payments Henry had never owed, notices of foreclosure for debts that had been fabricated out of thin air. And she wasn't the only one. Mrs. Callahan had kept records, had collected stories from others who had been forced out under suspicious circumstances. Some had fought, some had tried to, but they had all lost in the end. Elena scanned the names. Some she recognized from the documents Calloway had given them, others were new. But the pattern was the same. Veterans, elderly homeowners, people who lived alone, easy targets. By the time she left Mrs. Callahan's house, Elena knew what she had to do. Chapter 8. The Final Push. Elena and Karen spent the next week building their case, gathering statements, connecting the dots between every fraudulent sale and every corrupt official who had played a part. They weren't just fighting to get her home back anymore. They were exposing an entire system, one that had operated unchecked for years. And then, just when they thought they had everything in place, the final blow came. Karen's office was set on fire. It happened in the middle of the night. No witnesses, no clear suspects. The fire department ruled it an accident, an electrical issue. But they both knew better. The files were gone, at least the physical ones. But Karen had been prepared for that. Every document, every piece of evidence, had already been backed up and distributed. They're desperate, Karen said the next morning, standing outside the smoldering remains of her office. That means we're close. Elena nodded, her hands tightening into fists. They had tried to erase her home. Now they were trying to erase the case. But she wasn't going to let them win. It was time to end this. Chapter 9. The Endgame. Elena watched the last wisps of smoke rise from the blackened remains of Karen's office, the air still thick with the acrid stench of burned paper and melted plastic. The fire department had left, the police had done their obligatory sweep, and now all that was left was the undeniable truth. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately set that fire, just as someone had deliberately forged her signature, stolen her home, and tried to erase every trace of their crime. The difference was, this time they had made a mistake. They had shown just how desperate they were. Karen stood beside her, her arms crossed, her face unreadable behind the flickering glow of the streetlights. She had always been composed, always approached things with the cool calculation of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating legal battles. But this time, Elena could feel the tension in her stance, the quiet rage simmering just beneath the surface. They're trying to scare us, Karen finally said, her voice low. Trying to make us believe this fight isn't worth it. Elena exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the wheels of her chair. Then they should have done their homework. Because I don't scare easy. Karen let out a humorless chuckle. I figured you'd say that. She turned to face her fully, her expression hardening. But we need to move fast. They've already shown they're willing to escalate. We can't just sit back and wait for them to make another move. We hit first. Elena nodded. Agreed. But how? Karen glanced back at the charred ruins of her office before letting out a long breath. I have backups of everything, copies of every document, every bank record, every fraudulent transaction. They didn't destroy anything we can't recover. What they did destroy, though, was the illusion that this was just another case. We can't rely on the courts alone anymore. We need to apply pressure somewhere they can't control. Elena's mind was already racing through possibilities. The fire had been a message, but it had also been sloppy. If they were willing to resort to outright destruction, then that meant they were running out of options. They weren't confident in their ability to win through legal means, which meant their foundation was weaker than they wanted people to believe. She just had to find the cracks and widen them until the whole thing collapsed. She turned to Karen. Who's funding them? Karen's eyes sharpened. You want to go after the money? Of course. People like Hale don't operate in a vacuum. He has financial backers, people who profit from his schemes, people who look the other way as long as the cash keeps flowing. If we cut that off, if we make them a liability, then suddenly he's not just fighting us. He's fighting to keep his own people from turning on him. Karen nodded slowly. All right. I can start pulling financial records, tracing transactions, finding out where the real money is coming from. But that's only one front. If we want to bring him down, we need more than just financial pressure. We need public exposure. We need people who know the truth to start talking. Elena thought back to Mrs. Callahan, to the quiet fear in the old woman's eyes, the whispered stories of stolen homes and shattered lives. People knew what was happening, but fear had kept them silent. But fear could be turned. If they were scared of speaking up, it was because they knew what Hale and his people were capable of. That meant they also knew just how much damage the truth could do if it ever got out. I'll talk to the homeowners, she said. We need them to come forward. If we can get enough people to confirm what's been happening, we can turn this from a legal battle into a public reckoning. Karen nodded. And I'll focus on the financials. If we can prove this isn't just fraud, but a coordinated conspiracy with money laundering and tax evasion involved, then we bring in federal agencies. The city might protect him, but the IRS won't. They had a plan. Now they just had to execute it. Chapter 10, The Victory. Over the next several days, Elena worked her way through the neighborhood, talking to the people who had lived there for years. The ones who had seen the sudden disappearances, the fraudulent evictions, the homes changing hands under suspicious circumstances. At first, most of them refused to talk. They kept their doors half shut, their voices barely above a whisper, their eyes darting to the street as if expecting someone to be watching. But Elena wasn't easily dismissed. She was relentless, pushing past their fear with quiet persistence, showing them the evidence Karen had gathered, the documents that proved they weren't alone, that what had happened to them wasn't just bad luck or bureaucratic mistakes, but an intentional, calculated crime. Slowly, the walls began to crack. One by one, people started talking. They told her about the threats, the false notices, the officials who had ignored their complaints, the lawyers who had refused to take their cases. They showed her eviction papers with forged signatures, tax documents that listed debts they had never accrued, foreclosure notices for mortgages they had paid off years ago. And then, finally, someone gave her the break she needed. A man named Daniel O'Keefe, a retired contractor who had lost his home under circumstances almost identical to hers, handed her a folder of documents he had kept hidden for years. He had once worked on renovations for one of Hale's properties, back when Hale was still running things openly instead of through shell companies. Inside the folder were invoices, emails, and contracts, paper trails that linked Hale directly to the fraudulent transactions. Not through intermediaries, not through his fake companies, his actual name, his actual signature. Elena brought the documents straight to Karen, her hands nearly shaking with adrenaline. This is it, she said. This is what we needed. Karen flipped through the pages, her expression growing grimmer with each passing second. This ties him directly to the fraud, she said. If we push this forward with the financial records I've pulled, we're not just looking at a civil case anymore. We're looking at criminal charges. Elena exhaled sharply. They had him, but she knew it wasn't over. They filed the evidence immediately, submitting it to both the courts and federal agencies, ensuring that it would be impossible to suppress. The moment the case went public, the fallout was immediate. Hale's lawyers scrambled to do damage control, but the weight of the evidence was too much to dismiss. Investigators were called in, warrants were issued, and then, just as they were preparing for the final push, Karen's car was run off the road. Elena got the call at 2 o'clock in the morning. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, a hospital administrator telling her that Karen had been in an accident, that she was stable but unconscious. Elena gripped the phone so hard it nearly cracked. She drove to the hospital in silence, her mind cold, sharp, lethal. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was war. She sat by Karen's bedside, staring at the bruises blooming across her face, the bandages wrapped around her arms. The doctor said it was a miracle she had survived, but Elena knew better. It wasn't luck. It was a message. She leaned in close, whispering under her breath. They should have killed me when they had the chance. Because now there's nothing left to hold me back. Chapter 11, The Aftermath. Elena sat in the hospital room, staring at Karen's unconscious form, listening to the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The bruises along her arms, the deep cut above her eyebrow, the swelling along her ribs. It was all a reminder that this wasn't just about legal filings and property disputes anymore. This was a war, and their enemies had just made it very clear they were willing to spill blood to protect themselves. The police report had labeled it as a tragic accident, citing wet road conditions and an unfortunate loss of control. But Elena had spent too many years analyzing blast patterns and sabotage techniques to believe in coincidences. Karen's car hadn't simply lost control. Someone had forced it off the road. Someone had decided she was too much of a threat. But they had failed, and that failure was about to cost them everything. Elena stood, pushing away from the chair, her body tight with strained fury. She leaned down, gripping Karen's hand just for a second, grounding herself. "Rest," she whispered. "I'll handle the rest." Then she left. She drove straight to Karen's office, or what remained of it. The burned-out husk of the building still smelled like smoke, the edges of the structure blackened and skeletal in the pale morning light. Fire investigators had already concluded their reports, but Elena wasn't there for evidence. She was there to make sure the people responsible knew they had made the wrong move. She made the call as she sat in her truck, hands steady, voice calm. It was a number she had only used once before, years ago, when she had needed a favor that no one else could deliver. The line clicked after 2 rings. "You still alive?" the voice on the other end asked, half amused, half serious. "Barely," Elena said. "I need something." A pause. "Names." "Douglas Hale." She let the name settle. "And anyone connected to his real estate fraud operation." Another pause, a breath of consideration. Then, "That's a big ask." "I'm not asking." Silence. Then a quiet laugh. "All right. Give me a few hours." She hung up without another word. She didn't need to say anything else. The wheels were already in motion. While she waited, she focused on the next phase of her plan. Karen had done everything right. She had secured copies of the documents, distributed evidence to the right people, made sure their case was solid even if something happened to them. But that wasn't enough anymore. The legal system moved too slowly, and Elena had no doubt that Hale's people were already working behind the scenes to delay, suppress, or outright destroy anything that could take them down. She couldn't rely on the courts alone. She needed to make sure there was nowhere left for them to hide. So she went to the press. Not the major networks. They were too easily bought, too tangled in political alliances to take a risk on a case like this. No, she went to the independent investigative journalists, the ones who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by exposing corruption. She laid out the entire story, handed over the evidence, and made sure they understood exactly what was at stake. "You realize if we run this, they'll come after you harder," one of the reporters warned, glancing at the stack of files she had handed him. Elena met his gaze without hesitation. "Let them." The article dropped 2 days later, and the fallout was immediate. The public backlash was explosive. Social media erupted with outrage as the details of the fraudulent sales, the forged documents, and the targeted theft of homes from vulnerable individuals became public knowledge. Victims started coming forward, their stories echoing the same patterns: forced evictions, fake debt notices, intimidation tactics. The pressure on law enforcement became impossible to ignore, and suddenly the case that had been crawling through the system was moving at breakneck speed. Hale's lawyers scrambled to control the damage, issuing vague statements about misunderstandings and legal complexities, but the cracks were already showing. His backers, the ones who had quietly funded his operations in exchange for lucrative real estate deals, were starting to distance themselves, pulling their support, cutting ties before the full weight of the investigation landed on them. And then came the arrests. Elena watched from a distance as police raided Hale's offices, as his associates were dragged out in handcuffs, their faces pale, their carefully constructed empires crumbling beneath them. But Hale himself was nowhere to be found. She wasn't surprised. Cowards like him never stayed to face the consequences of their actions. They ran, hid behind legal loopholes, disappeared before justice could catch up. But Elena had planned for that, too. Her phone buzzed, and she answered without looking at the screen. "Got him," the voice on the other end said. She exhaled slowly. "Where?" The location was a private airstrip just outside the city, one that catered to wealthy individuals looking to leave quickly and quietly when things went south. Hale had probably assumed he had enough connections to keep himself safe, enough money to buy his way out of trouble. He had miscalculated. Elena arrived before the police did, rolling onto the tarmac just as Hale's sleek black SUV pulled up beside a waiting jet. He stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit, his face tense but composed. He still thought he had a way out. She made sure he knew he didn't. She wheeled forward, positioning herself between him and the plane. "Going somewhere?" she asked, her voice cold. Hale's expression shifted, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he smoothed it over with forced civility. "Miss Martinez," he said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "I assume you're here to make a scene." "No," she said simply. "I'm here to watch." His brow furrowed. "Watch what?" And then he heard the sirens. Hale turned, his body going rigid as flashing red and blue lights filled the darkened airstrip. Officers poured onto the tarmac, blocking the exits, moving in with grim determination. His eyes snapped back to her, filled with sudden, desperate fury. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice trembling with rage. Elena leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said. "But you are." The officers reached him before he could respond, pulling his hands behind his back, reading him his rights as they led him away. Elena watched until he was gone, until the plane's engines powered down, until the chaos settled into the quiet aftermath of victory. She felt no relief, no triumph, only the steady, unshakable certainty that she had done what needed to be done. Hale had tried to erase her. He had failed. Chapter 12, The Rebuilding. The trial took months longer than Elena had anticipated, but in the end, it didn't matter. The evidence was overwhelming. Hale's lawyers tried every possible defense, technicalities, procedural delays, shifting blame to lower-level operatives, but nothing worked. The forged documents, the fraudulent property transfers, the bribery records, the testimonies of those who had lost their homes, it all painted a picture too damning to ignore. The prosecution dismantled every weak excuse, and when the verdict was finally read, Elena felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of inevitability. Guilty. The word rang through the courtroom like a final nail in the coffin. Hale didn't react much, just sat there with the stiff, empty expression of a man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, only to realize too late that he wasn't. The judge didn't hold back in sentencing, citing the scale of the fraud, the calculated nature of his crimes, and the lives he had ruined in the process. Decades in prison, no parole, no appeals that could save him. His empire had crumbled, and now he was going exactly where he belonged. Elena didn't stay for the aftermath. She didn't need to hear the reporters dissecting the case, didn't need to see the desperate attempts of his remaining allies to distance themselves. It was over. She had done what she came to do. Her house had been returned to her, the fraudulent sale annulled, her name reinstated as the rightful owner. The court had ruled that all properties stolen through Hale's scheme were to be returned to their original owners or their surviving families. Those who had passed away before they could reclaim their homes had their estates compensated. Every person who had suffered under Hale's network of corruption had finally received justice. The neighborhood board had been dismantled entirely. Every one of its members had either been arrested for their involvement or had resigned in disgrace, their reputations irreparably destroyed. The city officials who had facilitated the fraud, the clerks who had turned a blind eye, the notaries who had rubber-stamped forged documents, none of them had escaped unscathed. Some faced criminal charges, others simply lost everything they had built. The machine that had operated so efficiently for years had been reduced to scrap. Karen had recovered from her injuries, though the scars from her accident remained. She had chosen to step away from high-profile legal battles after the case, deciding that she had done enough, that she had fought the fights that mattered. Elena understood. Not all wars had to last forever. They had won. That was enough. Elena returned to her house on a quiet morning, the first time she had stepped inside since the day she had left for her deployment. It was strange, walking through the familiar space, knowing it had nearly been taken from her forever. The furniture had been sold off when the property was flipped, the walls painted, the small details of her life erased. But the foundation was still there. The bones of her home had survived, and she would rebuild. She spent the next few weeks restoring it, not just to what it had been, but to what she needed it to be now. She replaced what was lost, reclaimed what she could, and let go of the things that no longer fit. The wheelchair ramp she had once seen as an unwanted necessity now felt like a permanent part of the house, a reminder that she had adapted, survived, and reclaimed her space on her own terms. The neighborhood was quieter now. Some of the families who had been displaced returned, trying to rebuild just as she had. Others had moved on, unwilling to live in a place that had once betrayed them. There were new neighbors, people who didn't know the history, who simply saw it as another suburban street. That was fine. The past didn't need to weigh on them the way it had on her. One afternoon, as she sat on the front porch, sipping coffee and watching the world settle back into place, an older woman from down the street approached hesitantly. Elena recognized her, one of the women who had been too afraid to speak before. She held something in her hands, a small wooden box, worn with age. "I kept this," the woman said, offering it out. "It belonged to Henry. He would have wanted you to have it." Elena took the box carefully, opening it to find a collection of old military patches, medals, and a folded letter with faded ink. Henry, the Marine who had lost his home. Before she could stop it, his memory hadn't been erased. Someone had kept it alive. She nodded to the woman. "Thank you." The woman hesitated, then let out a small, relieved breath. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I was scared." Elena met her gaze. "It's over now." The woman nodded and left, and Elena sat there for a long time, the weight of everything finally settling. She had won, not just her home, not just the case, but the battle for something bigger. Hale and his kind had operated in the shadows for years, counting on silence, on people looking the other way, on victims too beaten down to fight back. She had shattered that illusion. People knew now. They would remember. And even if new faces tried to rise and take what didn't belong to them, the world wouldn't be so quick to let it happen again. She placed the box beside her and leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her. She had her home. She had her peace. And this time, no one was ever going to take it from her again. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.